The night my husband and his mother threw me out of my own house. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't even cry. I stood there in the middle of my living room, staring at the man I had built 8 years of my life with, and realized something cold and precise. This wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. A coordinated one. Lauren was sitting on my sofa, her bare legs tucked beneath her, wearing Andrew's white button-down shirt, the one I bought him last Christmas. My Christmas gift. She looked younger than 27 in that moment. Younger and smug. Andrew didn't look ashamed. He looked relieved. And then Amanda stepped out of my kitchen. She wiped her hands on a dish towel like she was hosting a dinner party. Like I was the uninvited guest. "Rachel," she said calmly, "this isn't working anymore." That was the moment I understood. The late nights. The guarded phone. The new passwords. This had been building long before I walked through that door. Andrew folded his arms and said he was tired. Tired of the tension. Tired of my job. Tired of competing with my career. Amanda added, "A marriage needs balance. You're never home." I looked around my house, my furniture. My framed degrees on the wall. The kitchen I renovated with my bonus from an investigative series. And I realized they were about to tell me something worse than the affair. They were about to tell me to leave. I had come home early from a reporting trip to Milwaukee. It was supposed to be a surprise. I even stopped for Andrew's favorite takeout on the way. The container was still warm in my hand when I opened the door and heard laughter. Not nervous laughter. Comfortable laughter. Lauren's car was in the driveway. But I hadn't recognized it at first. Why would I? Andrew had mentioned her before. The new accountant. Efficient. Organized. Essential to a new subcontractor project his firm had just taken on. When I stepped into the living room and saw her sitting there, barefoot and settled, it felt less like discovering an affair and more like walking into a rehearsal I hadn't been invited to. Andrew didn't jump. He didn't scramble for excuses. He stood up slowly and said, "We need to talk." That phrase, always a warning. He told me he had been unhappy for a long time, that we had grown apart, that my investigative reporting schedule made it impossible to build a real home. He said Lauren understood his world better. She was supportive. Present. Flexible. Amanda leaned against the counter and nodded in agreement. "Andrew deserves someone who prioritizes him," she said. "Not someone chasing corporate scandals every week." I stared at her. This was the same woman who had toasted my journalism awards at Thanksgiving dinners. The same woman who told her friends she was proud to have a daughter-in-law on television. Now she was rewriting me in real time. "I live here," I said finally. Andrew's jaw tightened. "The house is in my name." The words landed heavier than the affair. We bought the house 3 years into our marriage. The down payment had come from our joint account, my bonus included. But legally, the mortgage paperwork listed Andrew as primary borrower because of his credit structure at the time. A technicality. One I had trusted. Amanda stepped forward. "You should pack a bag tonight. We can handle the legal details later." Lauren shifted slightly on the couch, adjusting the shirt around her shoulders. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was permission. I felt something inside me fracture, but not in the way they expected. I wasn't collapsing. I was cataloging the timeline, the tone, the coordination. "You're asking me to leave my own home?" I asked. Andrew exhaled. "I'm telling you, it's better if you do." There was no apology in his voice. Only calculation. I walked upstairs slowly. Every step felt detached, like I was watching someone else move through my life. I packed a small suitcase, clothes, my laptop, a folder of personal documents. I deliberately left the framed wedding photo on the dresser. When I came back down, Amanda was rinsing dishes. Andrew was scrolling on his phone. Lauren was still on my couch. "Where will you go?" Andrew asked. Not unkindly, just detached. "I'll figure it out," I said. That was true. I always did. As I stepped outside, the cool Chicago night air hit my face. The porch light flickered behind me. For a second, I almost turned around, not to plead, but to memorize the image. Instead, I walked to my car and placed the suitcase in the trunk. I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. The house looked the same from the outside. Calm. Solid. Ordinary. But inside, something had shifted. They thought they had just replaced me. What they didn't know was that for months, I had already been noticing things. Transfers from our joint account that didn't align with Andrew's explanations. Late-night emails that didn't match the narrative of overtime. Investment documents that didn't quite make sense. I hadn't confronted him. I had observed. And as I sat there in the dark, one realization settled over me with chilling clarity. They believed I was walking away defeated. They had no idea I was walking away with evidence. I didn't start the car right away. I sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the dark windows of the house Andrew had just claimed as his. 8 years of marriage, reduced to a technicality and a locked door. The porch light cast a pale glow across the driveway. And for a moment, I wondered if one of them was watching me from behind the curtains. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't even crying. I was thinking. Andrew hadn't looked surprised when I walked in that night. That was what kept replaying in my head. He hadn't scrambled to invent a lie. He hadn't begged for forgiveness. He had been prepared. Prepared meant planning. And planning meant timeline. 6 months earlier, Andrew had been promoted to senior project manager at his construction firm. We had celebrated at a rooftop bar overlooking the Chicago River. Amanda had toasted to new beginnings, and Lauren had been there too, smiling politely across the table. I remembered thinking she was a little too comfortable for someone so new to the company. That was when the late meetings began. At first, it sounded reasonable. Large infrastructure projects meant long hours. Regulatory approvals. Vendor negotiations. I knew how demanding professional life could be. I covered corporate fraud and compliance failures for a living. I understood pressure. But then the details stopped aligning. Andrew began guarding his phone like it contained state secrets. His laptop, once left open on the kitchen counter, now closed automatically within seconds of inactivity. Passwords changed. Shared cloud folders quietly restructured. One night, I asked casually, "Who's Lauren?" He paused half a second too long before answering. "Accounting. She handles subcontractor reconciliation." "Reconciliation." He said it like it was a shield. I didn't press. That wasn't how I worked. I never confronted without information. I never accused without documentation. In my profession, assumptions destroyed credibility. Instead, I watched. The first red flag wasn't Lauren. It was the money. I noticed a transfer from our joint account labeled as an investment allocation. The amount wasn't enormous. Not enough to trigger alarm in someone who wasn't paying attention. But I paid attention for a living. 2 weeks later, another transfer. Slightly higher. Same investment entity. When I asked Andrew about it, he said it was part of a private opportunity connected to a subcontractor on his new project. Short-term growth. He called it. Smart diversification. I let it go publicly. Privately. I screenshotted the transactions. The amounts escalated over time. Structured. Clean. Intentional. Then there was the email. One evening, Andrew left his laptop open while he showered. A notification slid into the corner of the screen. Lauren's name. Time-stamped well past midnight. The subject line wasn't professional. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The tone was obvious in the phrasing. When I mentioned it later, he smiled too quickly. She works odd hours. That's all. That night, he slept facing the opposite direction. Amanda's behavior shifted around the same time. She began calling Andrew more frequently, asking about his projects, his schedule, whether I was supporting him properly. At family dinners, she made subtle comments about how demanding journalism could be on a marriage. "You're always chasing scandals," she once said, slicing her roast neatly. "Men need stability." I remembered laughing lightly at the time. I thought she was being old-fashioned. Now I realized she was repositioning the narrative. Lauren's name surfaced more often in conversation. Andrew praised her efficiency, her attention to detail, her flexibility. Flexible again. I replayed a moment from 3 months ago. We had been driving home from dinner when Andrew snapped at me for questioning the subcontractor tied to his latest project. I had recognized the company name from a sealed court filing years earlier. Regulatory scrutiny. Potential financial irregularities. Not everything is a scandal, he said sharply. That was the first time his irritation felt defensive instead of tired. Back in my car that Saturday night, the pattern clicked into place like a completed puzzle. The transfers began after his promotion. The emails followed the transfers. The business trips coincided with larger allocations. And Amanda's tone shifted when the financial behavior did. This wasn't just an affair. It was alignment. I finally started the engine. But instead of driving immediately, I opened my banking app. The most recent transfer had occurred 5 days earlier, larger than the previous ones, routed through the same investment entity. An entity that, as far as I could tell, had no public-facing profile beyond shell registration documents. I felt something colder than anger settle into my chest. If Andrew had simply fallen in love with someone else, that would have been devastating enough. But the money suggested something else, something structured, something concealed. As I pulled away from the house, I didn't think about Lauren sitting on my sofa. I thought about numbers. I thought about how many transfers I had quietly documented. I thought about the prenuptial agreement my father insisted on before our wedding, an agreement Andrew skimmed with visible impatience. And I thought about one clause in particular, one that required full transparency in any use of joint marital assets. Andrew believed he had removed me from the house. He had forgotten that I was the one who knew how to follow a paper trail. By the time I merged onto Lakeshore Drive, I wasn't picturing Lauren in my kitchen. I was reconstructing a timeline, and the more I reconstructed it, the less this looked like betrayal. It looked like exposure waiting to happen. The next morning, I drove back to the house. Not to argue, not to beg, just to collect what was mine. The sun was barely up over the quiet Chicago street, and everything looked deceptively normal. The same maple tree in the front yard. The same flower pots I had arranged on the porch last spring. The same navy door I had painted myself. Andrew's car was gone. Lauren's wasn't. I parked at the curb instead of the driveway. A small, deliberate distance. I walked up the front steps with a spare box tucked under my arm and slid my key into the lock. It didn't turn. I pulled it out. Tried again. Nothing. The metal felt colder than it should have in late September. They had changed the locks overnight. For a brief second, something sharp rose in my throat, not grief, not rage, something closer to humiliation. I imagined how quickly they must have done it. Called a locksmith after I drove away. Erased me before midnight. I knocked once. Firmly. Footsteps approached. The door opened, and Amanda stood there like she had been waiting. She was dressed neatly, pearls at her collarbone, hair perfectly set. Behind her, I could smell coffee brewing, the domestic calm of a Sunday morning. "Rachel," she said, not unkindly. "You should have called." "I live here," I replied evenly. She stepped halfway into the doorway, blocking the entrance. Andrew thought it would be less complicated if we handled access this way. I'm here for my things," I said. "Documents. Personal items." She studied me for a moment, assessing whether I was going to make a scene. Across the street, Mrs. Hargrove from 2 houses down was watering her plants with suspicious attention. "You can take what's personal," Amanda said finally. "But let's keep this civil." Andrew appeared behind her. He looked tired. Not remorseful, just inconvenienced. "We're filing this week?" he said. "It's better if we don't blur lines." "By changing the locks?" I asked. He shrugged. "The mortgage is in my name. It simplifies things." Simplifie. I looked past him and caught sight of Lauren moving through the hallway. She was wearing my robe. Not Andrew's shirt this time. Mine. The robe my sister had given me years ago. She paused when she saw me. then continued walking as if I were a delivery driver standing at the door. Something inside me hardened. "I need access to my office," I said. Andrew hesitated a fraction too long before stepping aside. Amanda followed me as I walked in, as though supervising a guest rather than acknowledging I had once shared this space. The living room looked slightly rearranged. A framed photo from our honeymoon was gone from the mantel. Lauren had placed her handbag on the kitchen counter where my laptop used to sit. In my office upstairs, drawers were slightly misaligned. I noticed it immediately. I opened the bottom file cabinet. Several folders were missing. Not random ones. Specific ones. Bank statements. Investment summaries. Subcontractor documentation I had printed out weeks earlier. Andrew appeared at the doorway. "Don't take anything that isn't yours." I turned slowly. "Did you go through my files?" He didn't answer directly. "If you're planning to create problems, Rachel, I suggest you reconsider. Create problems." I walked past him without responding and opened my desk drawer. The external hard drive was still there. Good. I gathered a few boxes, clothes from the closet, books from the shelf, personal journals, every movement deliberate, calm. Amanda lingered near the stairs. "You don't have to make this harder than it is," she said. I paused. "You mean harder for Andrew?" She didn't respond. As I carried the boxes downstairs, Lauren stood in the hallway, arms folded. Her earlier confidence had shifted into something more guarded. "You didn't think he'd stay miserable forever, did you?" she said quietly. I met her eyes. "You think this ends well?" Her jaw tightened. Outside. The neighbor's garden hose shut off abruptly. Andrew followed me to the door. "Let's not escalate this," he said, lowering his voice. "Divorce is complicated enough." "I agree," I said. "Transparency helps." He stiffened. On the porch, I set the box down for a moment and looked back at the house. The curtains were slightly different. A small decorative change on the entry table. It was subtle, but the message was clear. They were reassigning ownership of the narrative. Amanda stepped closer. "You'll receive communication from our attorney," she said smoothly. "It's better if we handle assets formally." "Assets," I repeated, "including joint funds." Andrew's expression flickered. "Don't start," he warned. I picked up the box. As I reached my car, Amanda added one final comment. "Be careful what you think you're entitled to. Not everything has your name on it." I closed the trunk slowly. "Not everything has your name on it." I sat in the driver's seat again. But this time I didn't hesitate. They had searched my office. They had removed specific financial documents. They had changed the locks. This wasn't panic. This was containment. As I drove away, I replayed Amanda's words in my head. "Not everything has your name on it." She was right. But what Andrew had forgotten, what both of them had underestimated, was that the prenuptial agreement didn't require my name to be on every asset. It required disclosure. And if he had moved money without consent, if he had rerouted marital funds into that investment vehicle tied to his subcontractor project, then changing the locks wouldn't protect him. It would only prove intent. They thought locking me out ended my access. They had no idea the key I needed wasn't made of metal. By the time I reached my apartment, the sky had turned a flat, metallic gray. The place was small, one bedroom, narrow kitchen, windows facing a brick wall, but it was quiet. No laughter from the living room. No footsteps in the hallway that didn't belong to me. I placed the boxes on the kitchen table and opened my laptop. Paper files could disappear. Cloud backups couldn't. Within minutes, I accessed the shared archive I had quietly mirrored months earlier. Every bank statement, every transaction history, every PDF I had printed from our joint account before Andrew started getting territorial about privacy. I plugged in the external hard drive I had grabbed from my desk and felt something close to relief when the light blinked on. He had searched my office, but he hadn't known what to search for. 6 years ago, before our wedding, my father had invited Andrew to his office downtown. I remembered the polished oak desk, the quiet hum of air conditioning, The way Andrew leaned back in his chair with an easy confidence that bordered on impatience. Rachel's a journalist. My father had said calmly, "You both deal in high-risk environments. It's not distrust. It's protection." Andrew had laughed lightly. "I'm not planning on divorcing your daughter." "No one ever plans to," my father replied. "The prenuptial agreement wasn't dramatic. It didn't divide us into winners and losers. It set conditions, transparency and shared assets, mandatory disclosure of external investments, financial penalties for unauthorized transfers of marital funds." Andrew skimmed it that afternoon. He signed without reading every clause. I remembered noticing that at the time. Now, in my apartment kitchen, I reopened the document. Clause 14. Unauthorized use of joint marital funds for undisclosed personal or speculative investments constitutes material breach and triggers financial reallocation penalties. The language was clean, direct, unemotional. I pulled up our bank statements beside it. The first transfer had been modest. $15,000 labeled as an investment allocation. 2 weeks later, $20,000, then $35,000, then $50,000. Structured escalation. Each transfer routed through the same limited liability entity, an investment fund with minimal public footprint. I clicked into the registration details I had saved earlier. The entity was linked to a subcontractor Andrew's company had recently awarded a mid-sized infrastructure project to. The same subcontractor I vaguely remembered from a sealed compliance inquiry years ago. I opened a new document and began mapping dates. Transfer date. Andrew's late meeting. Lauren's time-stamped email. Weekend business trip. The overlap wasn't coincidental. It was patterned. My phone buzzed with a text from Andrew. "We need to resolve this without turning it into something bigger." Something bigger. I stared at the screen for a long moment before setting it face down. If this were any other corporation, any other executive, and I uncovered this pattern of joint funds being diverted into a subcontractor-linked investment vehicle during an internal project expansion, I would call it what it was. Conflict of interest at best. Fraud at worst. My hands moved automatically across the keyboard as I searched deeper into the subcontractor's filings. There were footnotes in one quarterly disclosure about private capital participation. No names listed. Just references to internal stakeholders. Internal stakeholders. I checked the dates again. The largest transfer from our joint account had occurred 3 days before the subcontractor secured final approval on Andrew's project. Coincidence? He would argue. Strategic opportunity. Perhaps, but he hadn't disclosed it. And that was the point. My father answered on the second ring when I called. "You sound steady," he said. "I am," I replied. "I need clarification." I walked him through the transfers. The investment entity. The subcontractor connection. He listened without interrupting. "Do you have documentation?" he asked finally. "Yes." "Original files?" "Backed up." There was a brief pause. "Then the clause is enforceable," he said calmly. "But you need to decide whether you want to pull that thread. Once you do, it doesn't stop at divorce." "I know." "Are you prepared for collateral damage?" he asked. I thought about Andrew standing in the doorway that morning. Amanda supervising my movements like I was trespassing. Lauren wearing my robe. "I'm prepared for consequences," I said. After I hung up, I reorganized everything into labeled folders. Transfers. Entity registration. Project timeline. Email correlation. Prenup clause 14. I wasn't doing this to destroy him. I was doing it because he had assumed I wouldn't. He believed I would focus on the affair. He hadn't expected me to focus on the numbers. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes briefly. 8 years of marriage didn't evaporate easily. There were dinners, vacations, inside jokes, shared dreams. But as I replayed those memories, they now felt layered with omission. He hadn't just replaced me in the house. He had replaced transparency with strategy. Another text from Andrew lit up the screen. "Let's talk like adults." I typed a short response. "We will," through attorneys. Then I reopened the subcontractor's compliance history and dug further. There was a notation buried in a regulatory memo 2 years earlier about concerns regarding internal financial participation by project managers. Project managers? Andrew's title. If he had routed marital funds into a vehicle tied to a company he oversaw, and if Lauren had facilitated the accounting side of it, then this wasn't a private indiscretion. It was exposure waiting to surface. I closed the prenup document and stared at the final line of Clause 14. Material breach triggers immediate financial reallocation and legal review. Andrew had changed the locks. He had removed paper files. He had positioned himself as the stable one. But he had skimmed the document that mattered. And in doing so, he had activated something far more permanent than a divorce. He had activated accountability. At 5:30 the next morning, I turned my kitchen wall into a timeline. I didn't think like a wife anymore. I thought like a reporter. I taped printed bank statements in a horizontal line, then marked dates beneath them in red ink. Promotion announcement. First transfer. Second transfer. Andrew's 3-day vendor conference. Lauren's midnight email. The pattern wasn't random. It was structured. I exported every statement from our joint account into a spreadsheet and sorted the transfers by amount. They escalated gradually, just enough to avoid immediate alarm. 15,000, 20, 35, 50, 75. Each labeled vaguely: capital allocation, strategic opportunity, portfolio diversification. I clicked into the investment entity's registration again. It was technically legitimate. Properly filed. Clean tax identification. But the managing address traced back to a law firm that specialized in corporate restructuring and internal capital partnerships. Internal capital partnerships. I cross-referenced the dates of the largest transfer with Andrew's promotion paperwork that I had saved in a shared drive years ago. His raise had been significant. His authority over subcontractor approvals expanded at the same time. Opportunity doesn't corrupt. It reveals. I opened the subcontractor's public filings and searched for the fund name embedded in the ownership notes. There it was. A small percentage of private capital involvement listed as strategic partner participation. No names. But the timeline matched. 3 days after our joint account transferred $75,000 into that fund, the subcontractor secured final approval for Andrew's infrastructure project. I stared at the screen. If he had invested personal funds into a vendor he oversaw, and if that vendor's approval affected his bonus metrics, then the ethical line wasn't blurry. It was visible. My phone buzzed. Andrew? I let it ring once before answering. This is getting out of hand, he said without greeting. What is? I asked calmly. Internal review. Finance is auditing subcontractor distributions. It's routine. But someone flagged participation disclosures. Participation disclosures. I hope your paperwork is in order, I said. Silence. Have you spoken to anyone? He asked. There it was. About what? I replied. You know exactly what? I don't discuss hypotheticals, I said. You should focus on compliance. He exhaled sharply. You're overreacting. It was a small private investment. It had nothing to do with project approval. With joint funds? I asked. He didn't answer. When the line went dead, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt confirmation. He was nervous. I opened my contacts and scrolled to a former newsroom colleague who now covered municipal contracts. I sent a brief message. Have you heard anything about oversight reviews tied to Midwest Infrastructure Group? 5 minutes later, my phone chimed. Quiet internal audit expanding. Finance team reviewing subcontractor equity disclosures. Why? Why? Because internal audits rarely expand without a trigger. I pulled up Lauren's professional profile. She had joined Andrew's company 8 months earlier, 2 months before the first transfer. Her role included vendor reconciliation and financial verification. Her email timestamps aligned perfectly with the transfers. Midnight confirmation emails. Early morning accounting updates. Weekend file adjustments. I remembered something else. 3 months ago, Andrew had come home irritated after a meeting. He claimed upper management was overcomplicating compliance. I had teased him lightly at the time, saying scrutiny was part of responsible growth. He didn't laugh. Now I understood why. I dug deeper into the subcontractor's filings and found a footnote in a recent amendment. A disclosure revision filed 2 weeks earlier, after the largest transfer from our joint account. Amendment date: 3 days after I had casually mentioned recognizing the vendor name from an old investigation. Had he tried to correct something retroactively? My phone buzzed again. This time, a message from Amanda. "We need to handle this privately. Don't let anger ruin Andrew's career." Anger. It was remarkable how often they framed documentation as emotion. I typed a response and erased it. Then I didn't reply at all. Instead, I opened a new document and began organizing my findings into structured sections. Joint marital transfers. Vendor approval timeline. Investment entity ownership structure. Lauren's accounting confirmation emails. Potential conflict of interest exposure. If I stayed silent, Andrew might survive the audit with a warning. If I proceeded formally, his promotion could collapse. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the wall of taped statements. This wasn't about revenge. It was about transparency. If he had disclosed the investment properly, if he had not used joint funds without consent, if he had not coordinated with the person he was now sharing my couch with, there would be no leverage. He created the leverage. I received another message, this time from my newsroom contact. Finance team requesting access logs from accounting department. Something's off. Access logs meant timestamps. Timestamps meant traceability. And traceability meant the narrative was no longer under Andrew's control. I closed my laptop and stood up, pacing the small kitchen. They thought I would be preoccupied with heartbreak. They thought humiliation would cloud my judgment. Instead, it sharpened it. The larger question wasn't whether Andrew had betrayed me. It was whether he had compromised corporate governance while doing it. And if that answer was yes, then the collapse wouldn't be personal. It would be institutional. I looked once more at the timeline stretching across my wall. Saturday night. They believed they had replaced me. Monday morning. The numbers were already shifting beneath them. They didn't realize they had underestimated the one person in the room who knew how to follow money all the way to the source. The email arrived just after 8 in the morning. Internal Compliance Review Expansion Notice. It wasn't addressed to me, of course. It came from my newsroom contact, forwarded without commentary. But the subject line alone was enough to shift the air in my apartment. Andrew's division was listed. So was vendor equity participation. I sat back in my chair and read the attached summary twice. The language was cautious, routine review, enhanced oversight, clarification of financial disclosures. But I knew how corporate euphemisms worked. Enhanced oversight meant suspicion. Clarification meant something didn't add up. My phone buzzed before I could close the document. Andrew. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. "Hey," he said, his voice deliberately steady. "Can we talk?" "We're talking," I replied. "I mean properly. Like adults." "That depends," I said. "On what you want to talk about." There was a pause. "Not long, but enough." "Compliance is reviewing subcontractor filings," he said. "It's standard procedure. Then you have nothing to worry about." Another pause. "Have you spoken to anyone?" he asked. The second time he'd asked that question in 48 hours. "I don't discuss my professional conversations," I said evenly. "You're not covering this," he snapped. The calm cracking for a second. "You're part of it." "No," I said. "You made me part of it." Silence settled on the line, thick and uncomfortable. "It was a private investment," he said finally. "It had nothing to do with project approval." "With joint funds?" I asked again. He exhaled sharply. "You're twisting this." "I'm documenting it." He hung up. I stared at the phone for a moment before placing it face down on the table. Within the hour, my newsroom contact sent another message. Lauren called into HR twice this week. Email access temporarily limited. Finance requesting accounting system logs. Limited access. Access logs. The details were small, but they formed a pattern. Pressure wasn't just theoretical anymore. It was procedural. Around noon, Amanda called. I almost didn't answer. But curiosity won. Her voice sounded different, less polished, more controlled. Rachel, she said, we need to discuss this before it spirals. It already has, I replied. Andrew is under tremendous stress, she said. There are corporate politics involved. People are jealous of his success. Jealousy doesn't trigger compliance audits. She ignored that. Whatever you think you know, you have to consider the long-term consequences. I said calmly. Then show some mercy, she pressed. Don't destroy his future out of anger. Anger again. I haven't destroyed anything, I said. Documentation has a way of speaking for itself. She lowered her voice. You don't understand how fragile reputations are in his industry. I understand how fragile ethics are, I replied. There was a brief silence. You could let this go quietly, she said. You could sign something? Keep it private. Move forward. A non-disclosure agreement. The idea wasn't new. It was predictable. I won't lie to protect him, I said. This is family. She snapped softly. Family doesn't lock someone out overnight. The line went dead. I reopened my laptop and checked the shared cloud activity logs. Andrew had accessed one of our old folders 3 nights earlier, too. 14 his IP address. He had been searching. For what? I wasn't sure. But the timestamp told me something important. He knew I knew. I verified the external backups again, double-checking file integrity. Every document was secure. Every transfer documented. If Andrew attempted to reallocate assets now, after the compliance review expansion, it wouldn't just be negligence. It would be concealment. My father called in the afternoon. I assume you've seen the audit notice, he said. Yes. Do not escalate emotionally, he advised. Let corporate governance move at its own pace. Your leverage is strongest when you appear detached. I am detached. Good. Then stay that way. Later that evening, Andrew called again. This time, there was no attempt at composure. They're pulling accounting logs, he said. From Lauren's department. From the project allocation system. That sounds thorough. This could ruin everything, he muttered. Everything. He meant his title, his bonus, his image. You should have considered that before you moved money, I said quietly. It wasn't illegal, he insisted. Was it disclosed? Silence. You're enjoying this, he said. No, I replied. I'm observing it. He breathed heavily into the receiver. We can fix this if you don't escalate. I haven't escalated. But you could, he said. You always could. That was the first honest sentence he'd spoken in days. After I hung up, I stood by the window and looked out at the brick wall across from my apartment. The city noise hummed faintly below. Saturday night, Andrew had stood in the doorway of our house and told me to leave. He had believed control belonged to whoever occupied the space. Now, control was shifting through emails and internal memos, through timestamps and audit expansions, through systems that didn't care about pride. For the first time since that night, Andrew didn't sound confident. He sounded cornered. And the only thing I had done was keep copies. The temperature changed the moment the memo became official. It wasn't gossip anymore. It wasn't a routine review. It was a formal compliance investigation with outside counsel attached to the file. My newsroom contact forwarded the internal announcement without commentary. Andrew's division was named explicitly, vendor equity participation under review. Accounting reconciliation procedures suspended pending audit. Lauren's department listed alongside his. I read it twice. Then a third time. There was no celebration in me. Just gravity. Within minutes, my phone began vibrating. Andrew didn't text this time. He called. I let it ring once before answering. They're overreacting, he said immediately. No greeting. No pretense. This is corporate politics. Someone's looking for a scapegoat. Compliance reviews don't expand without cause, I replied. You don't understand how these things work. He snapped. I understand exactly how they work. A pause. They're asking about participation disclosures. He continued, lowering his voice. They're questioning whether certain investments were properly documented. Were they? Silence. They're framing it like intentional omission, he said. It wasn't intentional. Was it disclosed? I repeated. I meant to fix it, he said finally. Before it got flagged. There it was? Not denial. Admission delayed. I'm not your enemy. Rachel, he added quickly. But if you've spoken to anyone, if you've said something that triggered this, I didn't fabricate your transfers, I said calmly. The line went quiet again. They're questioning Lauren, too, he muttered. Her access logs, her file edits. Transparency cuts both ways. You're not answering my question, he said. Have you talked to regulators? To anyone at the company? I've done nothing outside my rights. That was true. He exhaled sharply and hung up. 2 hours later, my contact sent another update. Lauren had formally cooperated with investigators, provided internal accounting documentation, submitted time-stamped reconciliations, positioning herself as compliant rather than complicit. I stared at the screen. Alliances built on secrecy rarely survive scrutiny. My phone lit up again. Amanda. I answered on the third ring. Her voice had lost its polish. This has gone too far, she said. It hasn't gone anywhere I didn't warn Andrew about, I replied. He made an investment, she insisted. People do that all the time. Not with joint marital funds tied to vendor approvals. You're exaggerating, she snapped. I'm documenting. There was a faint tremor beneath her composure. They're talking about termination, she said quietly. Do you understand what that means? His reputation, his career? I understand what breach means, I said. You could stop this, she pressed. You could sign something. A non-disparagement agreement. A confidentiality statement. We can negotiate privately. Negotiate silence. I won't protect something that wasn't transparent, I said. You're destroying him. No, I replied. The audit is examining him. She inhaled sharply. This is family. Family doesn't erase evidence. The call ended without resolution. That evening, an unexpected message appeared in my inbox. From Lauren. The subject line read, Clarification. Her tone was cautious, controlled. She wrote that she had never intended for things to escalate, that Andrew handled strategic investment decisions, that she processed what she was given. She implied, gently but clearly, that Andrew initiated the participation structure. And then she added one sentence that made me sit up straighter. There are documents he hasn't disclosed yet. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I forwarded the email to my attorney. If Lauren was distancing herself, it meant pressure was fracturing loyalty. An hour later, my father called. Lauren contacted you, he said. Already aware? Yes. Do not engage emotionally. He advised, every communication is potential leverage. I know. Remember, he added, once institutions get involved, outcomes move beyond personal control. I understood that the compliance review was no longer speculative. It had entered formal territory. Outside counsel meant documentation, interviews, audit trails. That night, Andrew left a voicemail. No anger this time. No accusations. Just strain. We can fix this if you don't escalate, he said. We can contain it. Contain. The word echoed in my head. He still believed the story could be managed. He didn't understand that once documentation exists inside a corporate system, containment isn't emotional. It's procedural. I deleted nothing. I archived everything. As I lay in bed that night, I thought back to Saturday. Lauren sitting on my couch. Amanda blocking the doorway. Andrew telling me the house was in his name. They had controlled the physical space. But control shifts quietly. Through memos. Through access logs. through clauses skimmed but not understood. The audit wasn't my revenge. It was the natural consequence of decisions Andrew believed would stay hidden. And for the first time since he told me to leave, he no longer sounded like the one in charge. The formal notice arrived in a thick envelope with Andrew's attorney's name embossed across the top. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Expedited asset division requested. I read it once, then again, noting the careful phrasing. There was no mention of the compliance investigation, no acknowledgement of the internal audit, just language about irreconcilable differences and equitable distribution. He was trying to separate the personal collapse from the corporate one, as if paper could compartmentalize consequence. An hour later, Andrew texted, "Can we meet? Neutral location. Just us." I didn't hesitate. Time and place. Downtown hotel lobby. Late afternoon. Before leaving, I emailed my attorney the location and time. I printed a copy of Clause 14 and slipped it into my bag. Not to threaten. To remind. The lobby was quiet when I arrived. Soft lighting. Low music. Polished marble floors that reflected everything without distortion. Andrew was already seated near the back. His posture rigid. He looked different. Dark circles under his eyes. Tie slightly loosened. The casual arrogance gone. When I approached, he stood automatically, like habit overrode pride. "Thanks for coming," he said. "You asked." We sat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He glanced around as if confirming we weren't being observed. "They've expanded the review," he said finally. "Outside counsel is involved." "I know." His eyes flickered. "Of course you do." "They're questioning intent," he continued. "They're treating participation as undisclosed equity influence." "Was it disclosed?" I asked again. He rubbed his temple. "It was informal. A private opportunity. Everyone invests in projects they believe in. Not everyone oversees vendor approvals for those projects." His jaw tightened. "It didn't influence the outcome," he insisted. "The subcontractor earned that contract." "With joint funds?" I asked quietly. He exhaled through his nose. "This isn't just about money," he said. "It's about optics. And optics can be managed." Managed. He leaned forward slightly. "If we handle this privately, it stays contained," he said. "I'm prepared to offer you a settlement beyond what the prenup requires." There it was. A number followed. Substantial. More than equitable division would demand. "In exchange?" I asked. He reached into his briefcase and slid a document across the table. Non-disclosure agreement. It restricted disclosure of financial findings, internal documentation, and any communication with regulatory or media entities regarding his company. "It protects both of us," he said. "You don't want this attached to your name either." "My name isn't on the compliance memo," I said. "Yet." He held my gaze. "If this escalates publicly, it becomes a scandal," he continued. "You work in media. You know how narratives spin. I also know how documentation works." He leaned back, frustration surfacing. "You're not innocent in this," he said. "You had access to the accounts. You never objected." "I objected internally the moment I noticed the pattern," I said. "Silence is not consent." He looked away. "Amanda thinks we can still fix this," he said. "She's speaking to advisors. We can restructure assets, refinance the house. Reset. Reset. You locked me out," I reminded him. "That was emotional," he snapped. "No," I said calmly. "It was strategic." His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, and something shifted in his expression. "What?" I asked. "Nothing." I waited. He swallowed. "Lauren retained separate counsel." "Separate? She's cooperating," he admitted quietly, "providing documentation." The alliance had cracked. "You thought loyalty would outweigh liability," I said. He didn't deny it. "She's protecting herself," he muttered. "As she should." He looked at me then, not with anger, but with something closer to realization. This is bigger than us now, he said. It always was. He pushed the NDA slightly closer to me. If you sign this, the settlement increases, he said. Immediate transfer. No litigation. No escalation. I picked up the document and skimmed it. Clause 1. Confidentiality regarding financial participation in subcontractor investment entities. Clause 2. Agreement not to provide documentation to third parties. Clause 3. Non-disparagement. It wasn't protection. It was containment. I won't sign, I said. Placing it back on the table, he stared at me. You're choosing to destroy everything, he said. No, I replied. I'm choosing not to protect what wasn't transparent. He laughed once, short and bitter. You always needed to be right, he said. I needed honesty. For a moment, the noise of the lobby seemed to disappear. You ever love me? He asked suddenly. The question hung there, raw and misplaced. I did, I said. But love doesn't override accountability. His shoulders sagged slightly. They're talking about termination, he admitted. If this is categorized as intentional omission, it's career ending. Then it shouldn't have been omitted. He looked at the NDA one more time, then back at me. This is your last chance to keep it quiet, he said. I didn't make noise, I replied. The system did. I stood. He didn't try to stop me. As I walked toward the exit, I heard him exhale heavily behind me. He thought money could reverse trajectory. He thought silence could restore status. But documentation doesn't unwrite itself. And once institutions begin asking questions, answers follow whether anyone signs an agreement or not. By the time I stepped outside into the Chicago air, I knew one thing with certainty. He no longer controlled the narrative. And he was starting to understand that. The official announcement came 3 days later. Andrew had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of a formal compliance review. The wording was neutral. Procedural. No accusations. No details. Just temporary reassignment of duties and ongoing evaluation of financial disclosure processes. Lauren's name appeared in the same internal memo. I read it on my laptop at the kitchen table. Sunlight cutting across the printed timeline still taped to the wall. For a moment, I felt nothing. Then my phone rang. Andrew, I answered. They've suspended me, he said, voice low and stripped of pretense. Pending review. I saw. They're acting like I hid something intentionally, he said. Like I manipulated vendor approvals. Did you disclose the investment before approving the subcontractor? Silence. I meant to, he said. I was going to restructure it. Before or after the audit. He didn't answer. They're questioning whether marital funds were used, he added quickly. How would they even know that? I didn't respond. Rachel, he said. Sharper now. Did you file something? I didn't fabricate your bank statements, I replied calmly. He exhaled roughly. They're interviewing Lauren again. She's cooperating fully. She's protecting herself. She's shifting blame, he said. Implying I directed the structure. Did you? The silence stretched longer this time. I didn't think it would matter, he said finally. It was a small percentage. It mattered enough to hide. He hung up without saying goodbye. An hour later, my newsroom contact texted. Board meeting yesterday. Questions about fiduciary responsibility. Possible termination for cause being discussed. Termination for cause. That phrase carried weight. It meant not just losing the role, but losing the narrative of success attached to it. That afternoon, Amanda called. Her tone had changed completely. This is spiraling, she said quietly. It was always going to, I replied. They're exaggerating, she insisted weakly. Corporate politics are brutal. They're looking for someone to sacrifice. Sacrifice implies innocence. She inhaled sharply. Andrew never meant to hurt you. This isn't about hurt. It's about revenge, she snapped. No, I said. It's about breach. She fell silent. After a moment, she added, the house may need to be refinanced. I let that sit. Refinanced meant liquidity issues. Asset strain. They're reviewing his bonuses, she continued. If those are frozen, we can't maintain the mortgage structure. I'm invoking Clause 14 formally, I said. Her breath caught. Don't. The documentation is clear. You'll ruin him. I didn't move the money. The call ended without another word. Later that evening, my attorney confirmed that formal notice of breach had been delivered to Andrew's legal team. Financial accounting requested disclosure of all external investments tied to project oversight required. Andrew's attorney responded within hours, requesting an extension citing unexpected developments. Unexpected. I drove past the house that night for the first time since retrieving my boxes. A for sale sign stood near the edge of the lawn. Discreet. Professional. I recognized the real estate company. The porch light was on, but the curtains were drawn tighter than before. Mrs. Hargrove was walking her dog. She glanced at me briefly. Then at the sign, things change quickly, she said casually. They do, I replied. As I drove away, my phone buzzed again. Andrew. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened later, his voice sounded hollow. They're recommending termination, he said, for failure to disclose financial interest tied to vendor approval. He paused. I never thought it would go this far. Neither had I. You didn't have to push it, he added. You could have let it stay between us. I replayed that sentence twice. Between us. As if joint funds weren't tied to corporate governance. As if compliance systems responded to emotion. As if I had the authority to halt an institutional review. I deleted nothing. The next morning, my contact confirmed it. Andrew's suspension had shifted to termination pending final board vote. Lauren had negotiated a lesser internal sanction in exchange for full cooperation. She had chosen survival. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the wall of taped statements that had begun this unraveling. I hadn't filed a complaint. I hadn't written a story. I hadn't contacted regulators. I had simply refused to sign silence. My phone vibrated again. Andrew. This time, I answered. They're finalizing it today, he said. Termination. For cause. I'm sorry, I said. And meant it. You're not, he replied bitterly. I didn't want your collapse, I said quietly. I wanted transparency. You got both, he said. There was no anger left in his voice now. Just resignation. They're reviewing the house next, he added. We have to liquidate assets to settle everything. I know. He exhaled slowly. Was this what you wanted? He asked. I looked at the timeline on my wall. Saturday night. Locked door. Changed narrative. Compliance memo. Suspension. Termination. I wanted the truth, I said. He didn't reply. The line went dead. I sat there for a long moment afterward. They had believed that pushing me out of a house meant ending my influence. They hadn't understood that influence doesn't live in a living room. It lives in documentation. And documentation, once exposed, doesn't retreat. By the end of that week, the board's decision became official. Andrew was terminated for cause. The memo was brief, professional, permanent, and for the first time since that Saturday night, there was nothing left to argue about. Only consequences standing exactly where they were always headed. The house went under contract in less than 2 weeks. I found out from a listing update alert I had never unsubscribed from. Pending. 3 bedrooms. Corner lot. Recently renovated kitchen. The photos looked staged in a way that erased history. Neutral throw pillows. Fresh flowers. No trace of the argument that had unfolded in that living room. No trace of the suitcase by the door. My attorney called that afternoon. We've received the updated financial disclosures, he said. There are discrepancies. In what sense? Andrew's termination package was smaller than projected. Bonuses rescinded. Stock options voided under the for cause clause. For cause. That phrase had followed him from corporate memo to personal balance sheet. And the house? I asked. The equity is thinner than expected, he replied. Refinancing attempts failed after the suspension. Sale is the cleanest path. Cleanest. I hung up and stared at the contract summary email forwarded to me minutes later. Projected proceeds after mortgage payoff. Penalties. And fees were modest. Not the lifestyle Amanda had bragged about over tea. Not the fortress Andrew believed he controlled. That evening, Andrew called again. His voice no longer carried accusation. Just exhaustion. They accepted the offer, he said. Closing in 30 days. I saw. There won't be much left after debts, he added. I thought we were building something stable. We were, I said, until stability became leverage. He was quiet for a moment. Amanda's furious, he admitted. She thinks you orchestrated everything. I didn't orchestrate the audit. You didn't stop it either. It wasn't mine to stop. He exhaled slowly. They're reviewing whether the investment needs to be reported to external regulators, he said. If that happens, if documentation shows undisclosed interest, it's procedural, I replied. You sound like a compliance officer, he muttered. I sound like someone who reads contracts. There was no anger in my voice anymore. Just clarity. A few days later, Amanda showed up at my apartment unannounced. I saw her through the peephole before opening the door. She looked smaller somehow, less polished. I won't stay long, she said as I stepped aside. She walked in cautiously, glancing at the modest furniture. This is where you're living, she asked. For now, she folded her hands in front of her. The sale will finalize soon, she said. Andrew's considering relocating. Starting over. Starting over requires disclosure of previous termination, I said quietly. She winced. You always did speak in facts, she said. I speak in reality. She looked around the room again. You could have kept the house, she said suddenly. You could have signed the agreement and taken the settlement. At the cost of silence. At the cost of pride, she corrected. No, I said calmly. At the cost of integrity. She stared at me. For 8 years, she said slowly. I thought you were too ambitious. Too focused on your career. I believed Andrew deserved someone who put him first. I did put him first, I said. Until putting him first required ignoring evidence. Her shoulders sagged. The neighbors are talking, she added quietly. People assume things. They always do. She hesitated. I didn't think it would collapse, she said. Not like this. Collapse doesn't start with an audit, I replied. It starts with small decisions. She nodded once, almost reluctantly. I shouldn't have told you to leave, she admitted. The words hung there. Not dramatic, not tearful, just acknowledgement. Thank you, I said. She left shortly after. I didn't close the door immediately. I watched her walk down the hallway with slower steps than before. Later that night, I opened my laptop and began drafting a new investigative series outline. Corporate governance failures. Undisclosed conflicts of interest. How small omissions evolve into systemic risk. The parallels were obvious, but I wrote them without personal reference. My editor called the next morning. You've been quiet, he said. Observing. You're ready to pitch again. Yes. What's the angle? Transparency, I said. And the cost of assuming no one's watching. He was silent for a beat. That's strong, he replied. By the time the house officially closed, the proceeds had been divided per the prenup and breach adjustments. Clause 14 held, joint funds used without disclosure resulted in recalculated asset allocation. Andrew's attorney did not contest it further. The funds transferred into my account felt less like victory and more like equilibrium restored. No windfall. No spectacle. Just balance. On the day the moving truck cleared the driveway, I drove by once more. The for sale sign had been replaced with sold. Different family. Different story. The house didn't look triumphant. It looked ordinary. As I sat in my car across the street, I realized something quietly final. They had believed removing me from that address meant removing my position. They had equated ownership with authority. But ownership built on concealment erodes quickly. Authority built on documentation lasts longer. I turned the engine on and drove away without looking back again. For the first time since that Saturday night, I wasn't thinking about Andrew, or Lauren, or Amanda. I was thinking about the article outline on my laptop, about systems, about accountability, about how easily power assumes it won't be examined. The house was gone. The job was gone. The illusion was gone. What remained was something steadier. Clarity, and that, I realized, didn't need an address to exist. The divorce hearing lasted less than 40 minutes. No raised voices. No dramatic objections. Just structured language and final signatures. Andrew sat across the aisle from me, suit pressed, expression carefully neutral. If someone had walked in without context, they might have mistaken it for a routine proceeding between two professionals untangling paperwork. The judge reviewed the prenup first. Clause 14 was cited explicitly. Use of joint marital funds for undisclosed external investment constituted material breach. Asset division adjusted accordingly. Andrew's attorney didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue. The house had already been sold. The proceeds distributed. Retirement accounts recalculated. Bonuses voided under the termination clause no longer factored into settlement. When the judge asked if we both understood and accepted the terms, Andrew said yes without looking at me. I said yes without hesitation. The gavel came down softly. Just like that. 8 years compressed into documentation and filed away. Outside the courthouse. The wind cut sharply through the street. Andrew paused near the steps as if deciding whether to speak. I didn't think it would end like this, he said finally. Neither did I. He adjusted his cuff absently. They've updated my employment status publicly, he added. Termination for failure to disclose financial conflict. I know. I've applied elsewhere, he said. It's not easy. It won't be. There was no cruelty in my voice. Just truth. He studied my face for a moment. You always warned me about optics, he said. About transparency. I warned you about risk. I thought I could manage it. You thought no one would check. He didn't deny that either. For a second, something like regret flickered across his expression. I should have handled the investment differently, he said. Or not at all. Yes. A simple word. But it held years inside it. Lauren's name wasn't mentioned. Amanda's wasn't either. Those dynamics had dissolved quietly once survival replaced alliance. Andrew shifted his weight. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said. Just acknowledgement that I didn't intend for it to spiral. Intent doesn't override outcome. He nodded slowly. I suppose that's the difference between us, he said. You plan for consequences. I plan for accountability. He gave a faint, humorless smile. That too. We stood there in silence for a moment longer. Then he said, Goodbye, Rachel. Goodbye, Andrew. He walked toward the parking lot without turning back. I didn't either. That afternoon, I returned to the newsroom for the first time since everything began. The hum of keyboards and muted conversations felt grounding. Familiar. My editor waved me into his office. You look steady, he observed. I am. You ready to move forward? Yes. He leaned back in his chair. The investigative series outline you sent, he said. We're greenlighting it. Full series. 3 parts to start, he replied. Corporate governance failures. Undisclosed equity conflicts. Compliance culture breakdown. I nodded. Sources, he asked. Public filings. Internal policy frameworks. Case precedents. Personal connection. He probed gently. None referenced. He held my gaze for a beat, then smiled slightly. Good. As I left his office, I realized something that hadn't been clear before. I wasn't rebuilding from ruin. I was returning to center. That evening, an email notification popped up from a financial compliance bulletin I subscribed to. Andrew's former company had updated its internal disclosure policies. Mandatory quarterly equity reporting. Independent audit cross-verification. Executive training on conflict of interest transparency. His termination had triggered reform. I stared at the bulletin longer than necessary. Systems adjust when weaknesses are exposed. Sometimes it takes a public example. My phone buzzed. An unknown number. I almost ignored it. Then answered. Rachel. Lauren's voice. Yes. I just wanted to say, she hesitated. I didn't think it would escalate either. It always does, I said calmly. I cooperated, she added quickly. I had to. I know. There was a pause. I'm leaving the company, she said. Different city. Different start. That's probably wise. Another silence. I'm not calling for sympathy, she said. Just closure. Closure isn't given, I replied softly. It's earned. She didn't argue. Take care, Rachel. You too. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a while. No triumph. No gloating. Just a quiet understanding that every player in this story had recalculated their path. Some by force, some by choice. Later that night, I opened my laptop and began writing the first paragraph of the series. Transparency is rarely tested in moments of comfort. It is tested when opportunity and oversight intersect. I paused. The words felt steady, accurate, not personal, but informed. Saturday night had felt like exile. A locked door, a suitcase, a smile behind someone else's shoulder. Now, months later, the story had shifted from personal humiliation to institutional consequence. Not because I exposed it, because I refused to conceal it. As I typed, I realized the most unexpected part of all this wasn't Andrew's collapse, or Amanda's apology, or the sale of the house. It was the absence of bitterness. What remained wasn't anger. It was alignment. My career intact. My integrity intact. My future unencumbered by silence. And for the first time since that door closed behind me, I felt something steadier than revenge. I felt restored. The first article went live on a Tuesday morning. By noon, it had already been shared across industry forums and professional networks. The headline was precise, not sensational. It spoke about disclosure failures, oversight gaps, and the quiet cost of assuming no one is paying attention. I watched the analytics panel update in real time, not because I needed validation, but because I understood impact. Emails began arriving before the end of the day. Some from executives who admitted they had never taken disclosure clauses seriously. Others from employees who had raised concerns internally and been dismissed. A few were anonymous. Short and direct. Thank you for saying what no one else would. I read each message carefully. None of them mentioned Andrew. None of them needed to. That evening, I walked along the river after work, the skyline reflecting softly in the water. Chicago felt different now. Not because the city had changed, but because months earlier, I had stood in a living room being told I was no longer suitable, that I was too ambitious, too independent, too focused on facts instead of feelings. Now those same instincts were the reason I felt steady. My phone buzzed with a notification from my editor. Second piece is trending. Legal blogs picked it up. I smiled faintly. It wasn't revenge that felt satisfying. It was alignment. A week later, Andrew's former company issued a public statement outlining updated governance protocols, mandatory equity disclosures, third-party compliance audits, executive training on conflict of interest ethics. The language was corporate and careful, but it was change. I didn't clip the article. I didn't send it to anyone. I simply acknowledged it and moved forward. Amanda never called again. Lauren relocated quietly. According to a brief professional update I saw in passing, Andrew remained offline. His digital footprint reduced to archived press releases and outdated leadership bios. Their absence from my daily life didn't feel like loss. It felt like space. On a Saturday morning, exactly 1 year after the night I was told to leave, I stood in my new apartment. Sunlight spilling across hardwood floors that were entirely mine. No shared mortgage. No joint accounts. No concealed investments. Just clean documentation and clean air. I made coffee slowly, deliberately. There's something about rebuilding that isn't loud. It doesn't come with applause or dramatic confrontation. It comes with quiet decisions made consistently. Not signing an NDA. Not deleting evidence. Not shrinking when someone tells you you're inconvenient. Those moments don't feel heroic at the time. They feel uncomfortable, lonely, uncertain. But they accumulate. Later that afternoon, I recorded a short video commentary for my investigative series platform, something I hadn't done before. Not about Andrew, not about my divorce, but about accountability, about how small compromises rarely stay small, about how silence can feel easier than truth until silence becomes complicity. When I finished recording, I didn't feel exposed. I felt honest. If you've ever been told you were too much simply because you asked questions, if you've ever been pushed aside for someone quieter, younger, more convenient, if you've ever stood in a room that was once yours and been made to feel replaceable, I want you to understand something. Replacement isn't power. Integrity is, you don't have to scream to reclaim it. You don't have to destroy anyone. You just have to refuse to protect what was built on concealment. The night I walked out with one suitcase, I thought I had lost everything. What I actually lost was illusion. And sometimes illusion is the heaviest thing you're carrying. I didn't get revenge in the way people expect. There was no courtroom outburst, no public humiliation, no dramatic reveal. There was documentation, procedure, consequence, and peace. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever chosen truth over comfort, stay with this space. There are more stories about accountability, about family dynamics, about hidden power structures that shape our lives in ways we don't always see at first. Share your thoughts below. Have you ever uncovered a truth that changed everything? What did you choose to do with it? Your voice matters here. And if you want to hear more stories about justice that doesn't rely on rage but on resilience, make sure you stay connected. Because sometimes the most powerful comeback isn't loud. It's lawful. It's steady. And it's entirely yours. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.